first time for others of you. Oh, my name is Michaela Leslie Rule, and I'm the owner of Fig and Sass, and I'm here with Meredith Fenton, and she'll introduce herself.
Hey all, this is Meredith or Mare joining from Oakland, and great to see so many familiar faces, and welcome to some new ones.
So as Shira said, this is our last webinar of this series. So we're on number 5. And for us, this really pulls everything together. So if you have been at previous webinars, previous trainings and workshops, you've taken this journey, as Shira said, with us, and you have found yourself at this storytelling webinar and workshop that will come after this. And essentially what we're trying to do here is just really kind of activate the things that we've talked about previously in terms of story, in terms of character, in terms of like the journey that you might want to tell that advances the work that you all are trying to do. And never, like, don't fear if you have not come to anything until this, it's still going to be an awesome, hopefully, training experience for you all, where we focus on really what is, I'm going to say, it's like the meat and potatoes, I guess that's what's in my mind. I must be hungry, but that's what storytelling is, right? It's the centerpiece of all the work we do. It's the thing that our audiences actually see and engage with. So we're excited to jump into that content today. And maybe before we do, or maybe it's happening in parallel because I can't see the chat right now, if you could just drop in some introductions about yourself. Let's see. And have that be your name, your organization, and your role. Maybe how you're doing today and what was your favorite story as a child. And I will start. I said my name is Michaela. I'm from Fig and Sass, as you know. I think I'm good. I'm really excited that we're here, that we've arrived at this point. And my favorite story as a child was Amos and Boris, which is about this tiny mouse that takes a journey on a whale and they become best friends, but they never see each other again, which is kind of sad, but I loved it. So, Mare, do you want to do yours?
Sure. So I'm Mare. I'm with Fig and Sass and a strategist, and I'm doing well today. Glad to be with you all. And when I was a child, I was obsessed with this book called There's a Rainbow in My Closet. And it's not actually what it sounds like, but it's about a young girl who's like super creative and imaginary, and about her special friendship with her grandma. And I love it. It's out of print, sadly, but yeah, a rainbow in my closet. And awesome to see folks starting to drop into the chat and share yours. I'm going to have to collect these all later to have some good stories for the littles in my life.
So we want to give you a sense of where we've been and where we're going today. I think we sort of did this, so we'll do it pretty quickly. These are 90-minute training webinars. You'll do this one today, and then some of you who have opted in or have signed up previously will attend a smaller group discussion and a workshop in the coming days. We started out with Communicate the Change, which was about change strategy. Let me just start again. Sorry. Communicate the Change, which is about creating a communication strategy in January. We spent some time thinking about messaging in February. In March, we talked about working with the media, and specifically earned media, more traditional media like newspapers and magazines, how to engage with journalists. Last month, we did some work on digital engagement and talked about the role of social media and some of the work that you all are doing with our colleague Mina Hussein, who joined us as a guest. And then today, as we said, we're talking about the power of story, which is really like, how do you talk about character and plot and journey and motivations and help that advance your work? The technical assistance workshops this week they're 60 minutes each. You all come, as if you've come before, they're pretty organic conversations, but we hope that you do come, and we hope that this is useful for you. The agenda for today, we did some welcome and introductions. We're going to talk a little bit about where stories fit into your greater strategy. We'll talk about why stories matter. What is a story? Like, what are the elements of story and how does it work? We'll give you some pointers on strategic storytelling, and we'll do a little bit of an activity thinking about your audience and your goals, and then therefore, what story does your audience need to hear? We'll talk a little bit about ethical storytelling and decolonized storytelling and the importance of that in the work that we do, and specifically as it relates to racial equity and gender equity. You'll do a story time activity, and then we'll have a discussion, and we'll close with a short poll. So that's our plan for today. So quick recap. we want you to start with the goal, right? Strategic communications is about communicating in service of a goal, in service of objectives, right? We're not just telling a story for fun. We're telling a story because it's going to advance our work. So you want to start with the goal, right? And that's what do you want to achieve? We always say the smarter, the better, right? Is it specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound? Then you're going to want to determine your audience. So who are those specific people without whom you cannot achieve your goal, right? And we have had all these conversations with many of you in these workshops, and I feel like we can say with certainty, you have so many amazing goals and ideas and things that you want to achieve. And really the work is to figure out who is your target audience for the work you want to do around communications. And then targeting your audience, right? So that's learning more about them. What do they care about? Who influences them? What kind of media do they watch? Who do they identify with? What types of like mental frameworks are working in their mind? Like, for example, if you have an audience that is very religious and identifies as Christian, you need to understand how their ideas about Christianity and their values about Christianity are interacting and influencing the way they see your issue. So, stories, right? So you get to this piece where you're saying, I want to learn more about my audience. And then what stories do I need to tell that interact with how my audience sees themselves, right? And where they get information and who they trust, and also serves your goals. So stories are in your materials, they're on your website, they're in your emails, social media, they're everywhere, right? They're a programmatic tool. And they're also something that sometimes you use to serve your internal goals around like relationship building for your team or your staff, or making sure, as Meredith says, everyone is singing from the same songbook, right? Those are all stories potentially. When we think about what our stories need to achieve, we want to think about them in these ways. And this is just, again, we are presenting frameworks. There are other ways to think about this. But one way to think about it is this kind of triptych, right? Which is that you want to activate your audience, persuade them, or neutralize them. So activation is that you're trying to activate audiences who are already supportive of you. So sometimes that could be, when we think about get out the vote, we're often not thinking that we want people to vote who are not, don't know what's going on, don't care what's going on. We want people to vote who care, but just are not getting out of their front door to vote, right? Or signing up to receive a ballot, right? We want to activate some kind of behavior. Another possibility is persuading folks, which is like trying to persuade people who are feeling conflicted about your issue. So that's where someone maybe doesn't agree with you, right? And you kind of want to find a tipping point. Like, how can we co-create materials or share stories that are going to push people in the direction that we want them to be in, right? Or to behave in a certain way. And then neutralizing people, which is neutralizing people who will never be supportive, right? And we talk about our target audiences. Sometimes we say, oh, it's the general public. Number one, right? You've heard us say before, maybe, or today I'll say it for the first time. There is no general public as an audience, right? It doesn't exist, right? And there are many different reasons for that, but part of it is part of the general public are people who are never going to agree with you, right? Now, there's a subset of that audience that'll never agree with you that you don't even have to message to at all. And then there are some that are interfering with what you want to accomplish, right? And neutralizing that audience is about helping them to not interfere in what you're doing, but you don't need to really activate them to do something in your favor. So starting with the goal, we're just going to give a quick example. The goal in this example is closing California's state-run youth prisons. Determining the audience for a persuasion audience, that could be the DJJ, it could be the governor, it could be elected officials. For people that you want to activate, and this is about like creating a voice or building power, it might be families of incarcerated youth themselves, or allies and advocates. And then targeting the audience, right? You might want to have stories from currently and formerly incarcerated youth that might be particularly powerful for your audiences, stories from family members that have been impacted by youth incarceration, stories of people who have worked in prisons, or stories from experts that are on health and justice. And in particular, right, that frame is about public health, right? And what is the impact? So Mare is going to jump in.
Great. So with that just sort of framing, we want to get deeply nerdy about stories, right? And so we want to just start talking about why stories are a tool that should be in every change maker's toolbox, right? And Ursula here says it well, like, as long as we look at human history, we can see records of humans telling each other stories, recording stories on cave walls, right? I once had a chance to see ancient pictographs that were thousands and thousands of years old, right? Those humans were telling each other stories, right? And so there's just something fundamental, and we want to get into a little bit about why. So on the next slide, in a second, we're going to press play on this video. There's no sound, so you don't have to worry about it. This comes from some research that was conducted in the mid-1940s. But I just want you to watch this. It's about a minute long. And then I'm going to invite folks to drop into the chat and tell me, what did you just watch? So Michaela, let's press play whenever you're ready. Great. So what did you just watch? What did you see? I'd love to have folks drop into the chat and just take a guess. What do you think that story just was? I'm seeing Vincent saying it was a divide and conquer story about capitalism. I see Jessica say the big triangle was a bully. Oh, that's what Jade said too. So big triangle bully story. What else do you think this could have been? Okay, so little people teaming up to overcome the bully. I see Nicole saying it definitely felt like some kind of oppression. What else? Conflict, bias. Lots of folks saw this bully story. Outwitting it, also seeing bully and violence and then getting, being able to outwit the bully. Resistance. Ooh, somebody said they saw what happens in their fish tanks, because the big fish are conquering, picking on the little guys. Some kind of keeping people out. Two parents fighting, the child is in the middle of intimate violence, and then they escaped. A Rorschach test. So the real answer, right, is you saw shapes move around a screen. But we as humans, there's something in our brains that makes us apply stories to everything we see. And who we are might have something to do with the story that we see. So for example, a lot of folks here, you all are folks who care about oppression, who care about protecting the little guy. And so it is not surprising at all to me that a lot of folks saw a story of an underdog or the little guys overcoming their bully or overcoming an intimate partner violence situation, right? Stories of resistance, stories of breaking barriers. I once had a group tell me that this was the history of agrarian organizing in the Central Valley. Folks see all sorts of things, right? And so what we need to remember is that because our audience most of the time are humans, right? They have human brains. So that means they're telling a story about everything they see. That means they're telling stories about our issues, our communities, our people, the youth that we support, our organization. And so that is part of why it's so important for us to really think about what story are we giving them. We want to give them a story that's strategic and that moves them into the place we want them to be, right? Depending on what we're trying to do, because otherwise they might make up a story that doesn't help us, right? So on the next slide, a little bit more about why stories, right? We know, and we've talked about before in this series, that we think communications should just be a transfer of information. I tell Victor a fact, and then Victor does what I want him to do, right? But unfortunately, we have learned that a lot of times we are more motivated by our feelings. And in fact, like Maya Angelou says here, you often forget like the facts or the details of everything a nonprofit organization does or could do, but you know how it feels when you walk in the door of a center that is inclusive and belonging. Or you know how it feels when you see a young person get up and tell a really courageous story, right? We remember those things more. And often that's what we need, is for what we're sharing with our audiences to stick with them. And then on the next slide, this will look familiar to some of you when we've talked about how much competition and noise there is for humans, right? We are not the only people that our audiences are hearing from. And we've talked about, how access to smartphones has made our attention span go down. Often though, if we start by telling a story, you just pull people in. You're able to get their attention, whether you're speaking or reading or showing them a video, that starting off with data or starting out with a mission statement likely is not going to achieve. But if you say, hey, let me tell you a story, it feels like that thing I saw a lot of folks talking about in the chat during our check-ins of like, my favorite stories were the ones my grandma told me or someone else in my life told me. You just got drawn in. It feels like this familiar thing, right? And the next slide. So then again, right, that's part of why stories help us make social change. A lot of times we're acting for folks to stand with audiences of our young people or our community that other folks don't know. They don't live in our communities. They haven't met our youth. And so a good example of this, if we go back to 2012, this was when Jose Antonio Vargas, a journalist, came out along with many other immigrants on the cover of Time talking about being undocumented Americans who were, now we know them to be dreamers, right? That they are folks who maybe were very young or did not have control over how they were brought to this country. Until that moment, a lot of folks had no picture of who immigrants were without documentation. And that by telling these stories, the stories of young people, starting to build campaigns, lifting up the stories of young people who were saying, we're here to stay, right? We developed for the American public, and you can fill in the slide, Michaela, with some of the other images, right? We started to paint a picture of a population of folks who needed policy change. Then the DACA program was introduced. Stories were being continued to be told, shaping who this community of people were. And that's how then last year we had this big win at the Supreme Court, where actually folks stood to stand with this group of folks. Without telling those stories, it would have been very, very difficult to first create policies to address the needs of this community, and then for there to be so much public support standing with Dreamers to ensure that their rights were protected, right? And so we can see on almost any major social change that you've seen in your life, whether it was the ending of apartheid in South Africa to the move for marriage equality in this country, to all of it, there was a way that storytelling really contributed to helping get to the line of progress that we were trying to get. A part of that, right, again, is about the science of stories. So our brains, and I am not a brain scientist, so we're going to keep this pretty simple, right? And if there are any brain scientists, feel free to drop in the chat and explain in even more detail. But what I do know about brains is that your prefrontal cortex, which sometimes people call your upstairs brain, that's where all your rational thinking happens. But the amygdala, which some people also call your reptilian brain or your flight and flight response, it's at the back of your brain. It keeps you safe. Way back in the day, right, humans were walking along the path. They encounter some sort of creature they've never seen before. The amygdala doesn't feel like the rest of the brain has time to like try to have a conversation. You have to make a quick decision. Do I run? Do I fight? And so that's what the amygdala is there to do, is to help your brain save power to make really quick decisions. Our amygdalas fire all the time. And often even just by when we are exposed to something that we're unfamiliar with or uncomfortable with, our amygdala fires up. and talking about some of the really challenging issues that you all work on, things like violence, things like substance abuse, often spark folks' amygdala, either because it sparks fear or confusion, or they're unfamiliar, or whatever it is that keeps them in a brain, part of their brain, where they're not able to access, okay, yes, I should make sure to have a voting plan and enact it. Or yes, I should go through these steps to make sure my young person is enrolled to be matched with a tutor, or whatever it is. And the thing about stories is that there's something that calms the amygdala, possibly because it's such a familiar experience, like we talked about. Your grandma tells you a story. In school, you're told stories. Most of our cultures have long histories of passing stories down. I come from a Jewish background. It's all about passing the stories down, right? From generation to generation. So that familiarity calms the amygdala and it makes audiences available to us in a way that they wouldn't be otherwise. On the next slide, part of that is because stories help create for people this idea of narrative transport. I'm sure you've experienced that thing where you're watching Netflix, you're like, I'll just watch one episode. And then somehow 6 hours later, you've binged two seasons of a show, right? Part of what has happened is narrative transportation. You've gotten lost in the story, and then also the algorithms of streaming make it easy to just keep going. But like you sort of lose track of things. And there's actually been research that shows when you are transported into a story, you actually sort of get to walk in the character's shoes. And that even when you're out of the story, there are consistent beliefs. And so that when you can get people transported into these narratives, you're more likely to help them make belief or attitude or behavior changes that would help them because they maybe have identification now with someone they didn't from that story. Or on the next slide, it talks about how empathy, right? You can really feel more empathy. And when you empathize with folks, or you feel something like love or hope or even fear, right? There's more ability to persuade and motivate folks to action. Great. So I'm going to hand it back over to Michaela to say, so what is a story? What sets a story apart from the other kinds of content?
Exactly. So what's a story, right? So this is, again, and I keep saying this, these are frameworks. These are ideas for how to think about this. It is not the end all be all. But we think about it as 3 C's. So we think about characters, like who is it about, right? Who is our story about, or who is driving the action in our story? Challenges that they faced, or also known as the action, as I said, and then the change, like what happens as a result of this story that folks go on. And I think it's important both to think about what happens to your character, how does your character change, but also what's the change that you want to see in your audience. So characters, choosing your characters. What does your character need to do for you to reach your audience, right? So one part is facilitating identification or affinity. I wrote in the chat when Mara was talking about narrative transportation and proximity. So this idea that in order for people to feel proximate or near to your issue or idea, they need to be able to identify with the character, right? And we think about that as a pathway to empathy. So we think about, for example, if someone wants to talk to me about something and they wants to engage me in a story, they need to think about my identities, right? I am Black, I identify as female, I am a mother of a young child. A mother as an identity could be a way to reach me through storytelling. The other piece is just your character can disrupt flawed mental templates. So sometimes, as Mara was saying, sometimes people's amygdalas are firing because they're encountering something that's new to them. I think a lot about, actually an example that we'll share in a bit, but I think a lot about how some people in our country are reacting to rights for trans people. Part of that is because they lack the proximity, or they think they lack the proximity with people who identify as trans, right? But one thing we can do to disrupt mental templates, that it's not scary or other or different, is to show trans people in the context of family and community as an opportunity for identification. Thinking about authenticity, right? And thinking about your character and how they will be perceived or not perceived as authentic. And what does your audience need to know about the character to understand their story? So challenges are the action, right? This is classic yellow brick road, right? We need something that happens to a person. We need to think about the details that we need to share about our story or about the journey someone is going to go on that will help them to be transported. And we want the audience to be able to relate to or connect to the person's experience. So we want to show some type of either a mirror or reflection of something that people know. Show versus tell, we say this all the time to clients and also in these trainings. We can use visual language. Here we have Snoopy saying it was a dark and stormy night, right? That is visual language that draws us in. We can all imagine what that looks like. Details, right, are important. Dialogue is incredibly important, and dialogue that feels authentic. If you have a kid from a community that sounds a certain way, right, we need characters that sound the same way, use the same type of language so that young people can identify and say, hey, yeah, this person is like me. Let's see, we say showing and telling, right? So just as an example, showing is sight, sound, smells, taste, right? All those senses, textures, right? And the things that tell are facts and statistics and examples and definitions. And as Mary was saying earlier, those things on the right that are about telling us that this is important, telling us the information, don't resonate with people in the way that stories do. And then the change, right? So how is the character changed? What's the moral of the story? What happens at the end of this? How are they transformed? And how can the world be a better place, right? If we listen to this person and we engage with this person's story. So this is one way to think about it. And you'll have all these slides after this, but we say, how did you get there, right? We're saying a person starts on the left and they get somehow to the right. And the story is, how did the person get there? There needs to be some type of challenge, something that they encounter, right? That changes them. And that's kind of that's the drama of the story, right? We usually start on the left for a journey story with setting the scene. We have what's here as a protagonist, but is the character, the main character. An inciting incident, something happens that pushes them on this journey to self-discovery or whatever happens for them. In some cases, that inciting incident could be engaging with one of your programs, right? And in other cases, the journey is this struggle, something happens, and then they encounter this program or this person or this group of advocates, right? That transforms them and changes them in some way or changes the way that they look at their lives. And you get to this moral, we have a takeaway and transformation. Is this still me? I think so. Yes, sorry. Yeah, the last thing to say is just that stories require simplification and focus, right? And so there's often we feel compelled to say a lot of things about the work that we do, but in order for storytelling to work and to work effectively and sort of be most strong, we really have to focus in, right, to those pieces, like what is the character, right? What do people need to know about this person, right? What type of change is going to happen as a result of this work? We need to get really, really specific. So simplification is key. And as Mary said, it doesn't need to be the whole story. It needs to be just enough, right? Just enough to pique people's interest, just enough to draw them in.
So let's talk a little bit about, now that we've talked a little about why stories matter and what do we mean when we say a story, how to figure out which stories are going to be most strategic for you. And this is where, again, going back to the goal that you have or goals that you have and thinking about your context and audience is really going to matter. But we just want to talk about some of the kinds of stories that tend to be very strategic for change-making organizations. And so the first, right? Sorry. On the next slide, great. Oh, so again, as a reminder, Michael already said this. Part of figuring out which story you need is to be clear not only on who your audience is, but what is the purpose of your story? Are you trying to motivate them to take action? Are you trying to have them feel slightly differently or help resolve some conflict by the end of the story? Or are you trying to have a story that can overpower maybe a story that is against odds with your goal? And so there are different things that stories can achieve. Sometimes we're trying to create that empathy or proximity or identification with a community of folks. Sometimes we need a story that helps an audience know what I am feeling is normal. And so we show them a character who might be feeling the same thing that they're feeling, but helps lead them to the action we want. Sometimes storytellers, right, are that voice of reason or a moral authority. Think about the role of like Yoda, if you've ever watched Star Wars, or sometimes how we position faith leaders to be moral authorities, right? So those are different ways that a different kind of story in a storyteller. Often stories can help paint a picture of what could be possible or the change you want them to make or you want a community make. Sometimes stories help paint a picture of the future. What's the vision? What will happen if folks invest in your organization, enroll their young people in your program? How do we help people believe that something is possible? Think of science fiction. Often it's telling a story of a world we've never experienced. So those might be different things that your story can help do, again, depending on what your goal is. So here's a story of what we call a why story. A why story is simply a way of, rather when somebody says, hey, why does your organization exist? Rather than answering with your mission statement, it's a story that explains that why. Why should folks be a donor? Why should folks be a participant? Why should folks want to apply for your job? And so this is an organization called Home Rise that's based in San Francisco and supports those folks who are experiencing homelessness or housing instability to get the kinds of programs and investment and support for them to find a permanent home. And so here you can see a story about George, who, we talk about his background, how music and faith are part of it, and what happened when he moved to San Francisco and didn't have a home. Then you can see here him talking about your home is your castle, home is everything. So again, you don't know everything that Home Rise does, but if you are rooting for George and you understand how he worked with resident services and now has a space not only to live, but this place to play his music, maybe that's just enough of a story for me to want to know more, to sign up for the newsletter, or to make my first donation. So those why stories, every organization should tell a lot of them. We also often are using stories, like we said, to persuade. And so often, rather than saying, hey, Michaela, you're wrong, I need to change your mind, it can be more strategic to show Michaela that it's possible for her to change her mind by telling the story of someone else who's made a similar shift. And so I still remember, this is a decade ago, but when President Obama changed his mind about his position on marriage equality. And it was breaking news because prior he had talked about the importance of domestic partnerships, about legal rights. And then he actually talked about how it was his daughters, his young daughters, who made him realize that he was wrong and that he had evolved on the issue and that he personally now and politically would support policies to make marriage equality legal. That is much more effective than all of the ways that it was like, we need marriage, we need marriage. It wasn't tied to a story of someone who used to be against marriage equality and had come along, right? This fostered a lot of abilities, people to at least think differently and be open. If President Obama can make this shift, maybe I can shift a little bit too.
And also maybe just to say that the language there is evolution. He doesn't say that he was wrong and now he's right. He says that he's changed, he's experienced a change, which is softer language to show change.
Yeah. We also often are just trying to humanize, like we said, to foster that proximity. And so sometimes we see this even in pop culture. When I think about, and I just came off the heels here in Oakland of a very long contentious teacher strike. But the way that teachers are portrayed so often really puts a lot of the onus on teachers. We don't, in many communities, or most, do not pay them what they're worth. We know that they're working in really hard contexts. And so then a TV show, I don't know if there's other Abbott Elementary fans in the house, so much of this is about telling the stories of what is it actually like to be a public school teacher. And you see that these are humans who love the kids, love the community, and yes, they're dealing with really difficult issues around funding and education, around being located in a predominantly Black neighborhood in Philly, but it's humanizing them, it's normalizing. And we have seen there's a lot of television shows that research has proved watchers of those shows have helped folks change and evolve their opinion, whether there's a lot of research about Superstore and how it's helped move narratives about undocumented immigrants because of a character named Mateo on that show, or shows like at 16 and pregnant that really humanized what it was like to be a young person and a young parent, that helped other young folks make different choices about whether or not they were ready to be parents. So really, whether it's in pop culture or the stories that you might tell of your own young people, just showing folks and humanizing the people really helps move them along.
Daniel, do you want to ask a question?
Yes, I wanted to ask, how do you avoid the insecurities when it comes to capturing the story?
Meaning of your young people, like if, or yourself, if you're thinking, I want to tell my story, I'm working with a participant and they might not be sure. We're going to talk about that a little. Was that what you meant?
It's more of just, I'm 23, so I guess like it's because I lack, like, for me, it's because I feel like I don't really know much of the world. I don't really know a lot of opinions. I am a biased person, knowing that. How do I know if I'm really like being fair? How do I know? So that I'm trying to get rid of the insecurities behind it. So how
I
do I?
see. Yeah. So one of the wonderful things about stories is it doesn't matter if you're 3 years old or 300 years old, you have stories to tell. And if they are your own stories based on what you've experienced in the world, even if I just tell you the story of what I ate for breakfast, right? It's my authentic story. And so that is also why a lot of your programs that you're all involved in probably use storytelling programmatically. For many years when I was organizing youth, so much of our programming was about getting young people in circle together, telling each other stories. And so sometimes before we start telling our stories out publicly to the world, we build that confidence about our own story by telling them to the people that are nearest and dearest. And then we're also going to talk a little bit later about about some of the ethics of storytelling, because we want to make sure we're not pressuring folks who are not ready to tell their story. We're wanting to make sure that we don't sort of have a preconceived notion of what the story should be. And so, Daniel, if I was working with you as a storyteller, it wouldn't be that, oh, I need you to have a full perspective or been all over the world to tell this story. I'd be interested in your real story and hopefully work with you to help figure out which part of that might be the one to tell. And we'll also talk about some creative approaches, because for some of us, it's not going to be our personal story for all sorts of reasons. It may be other types of stories. So yeah, feel free. We'll, drop in the chat if folks have other ideas for Daniel. And we're also going to dig into that a little bit more in a minute.
Hey.
So another kind of story you want to think about is you do this work every day, right? You show up as a staff or a board member or a participant and you're doing the work. But most people, even people who really like your organization, they don't get to do that. So how do you think about micro little stories that you can show? And this is a post from Californians for Justice from their Instagram, where they brought together 50 youth from around the state. And so then they created a series of stories just showing little snapshots so that folks who weren't going to get to be there could still come along on that journey. And so how do you let folks see what you see to paint a picture rather than just telling them, hey, my organization is changing lives? How do you show them that? Maybe letting through video, photos, and storytelling. I talked also about science fiction. A lot of times the world we're trying to create doesn't exist. So how can stories help show what's possible? And here's a version of a second person story where you're talking to a you, right? So the character is your audience and you paint a picture for them about if they donated, that they can help create a different San Francisco that is more supportive for the residents who are experiencing homelessness. This also comes from Home Rise that we started out with. Great. So now, Michaela, we're just going to we want to hear from you a little bit. We're going to show you a few of these types of stories and just want to hear a little bit from you all. Why might this have been a strategic story to tell? So, Michaela, I'll pass it to you.
So the goal for this is this is a Yeah, sorry. So the goal for this is to recruit 40 new participants for a youth tech training program. And the audience is youth in San Francisco, ages 15 to 20, and their parents. So I'd like you to just take maybe a minute or 2 minutes and just read through the story that's being told, and then just offer up to us, what feels strategic about this story? What was important about telling the story, given the goal and the audience? All right, what do you think? What's strategic about this story? Leslie, feel free to come off of mute.
It talked about a specific challenge and how the organization helped her overcome it.
Okay. Nicole in the chat, she identifies herself. Stephanie demonstrates the impact of the mentor matching program. Okay.
I also see Lorena's comment about personally identifying with Josephine as a first generation college student. So that's that identification that, oh, this person is like me. Maybe I want what they have. Or this is a great example of that why story.
David, belonging and community support system. Belonging, it's interesting that you talk about belonging because these are really values that are being elevated. And that's one of those important parts of the why, is getting to the shared value. Seb, go ahead.
Something that stood out to me was that as someone who also was first generation and comes from a family of color, something that my mom didn't necessarily have time to do but deeply wanted was to send me off somewhere where I would be safe. And what this does is it establishes compassion with the subject that we're learning about and helps us build a relationship with them. Even if it's very small, it helps us connect to them. And then it goes into, there's a mentor matching program. There is they teach skills on creating community and a support system. And if you're reaching not just applicants but their parents, you also want to assure the parents that their child will be taken care of. And so it establishes a connection and then goes immediately into what they provide and the community they can build. So it makes, in my head, as if I were a parent, it would make me feel more comfortable to send my child somewhere where I know they can still build community, especially if they're coming from a underserved community.
Thank you. Yeah. I'm seeing something else come up several times. So Sarah Hill, Vincent, Karen, Escalante, Dalton are all commenting on the photo, right? That the photo looks real and genuine, says Vincent. That Sarah says the picture shows the result because she's wearing the Berkeley sash. And then Karen, she identifies Karen Escalante includes a photo that shows the end goal of graduation. So I'm just struck by showing, right? Not only is it a sash that has symbolism, right? Everyone sort of knows what that means, but also that you see Berkeley there, right? So it's very clear. It's very clear for people that they can identify with this sort of rite of passage. So I think y'all did great. Let's do another one. So here, the goal is increase vaccination rates among Latinos in the Inland Empire, and the audience is Latino families, parents, young adults, and farm workers. And Meredith, how should we do this? Should I read it?
Yeah, so there's two pieces here that were part of a larger campaign where lots of stories were told. So on the left, you can see Luce, who's the executive director of an organization that's also profiled in this article. And you can see it's a very short story. Here at TODEC, we're all vaccinated. We are healthy. We are without side effects. Trust community. Very short story. But that also, we wanted to show you how this was part of a larger storytelling campaign that involved a lot of media. And it tells the story of a workshop that Luce and her colleagues were having to inform farm workers and agricultural workers about the vaccine, and how she incorporated her own stories. And I know it might be small on your screen, so I'll just say she held up two photos. One of her late uncle, a missionary Catholic priest, and the other of Reverend Francisco Valdovinos, who was a beloved local pastor. And both of those men had died from COVID. And so she brought their stories into her speaking. And then now her story and the story of this campaign are being used to try to increase vaccination rates. So why do you think this worked? Or what might have been strategic about this approach? So using people that might be looking up to, or I see this moral authority piece. Yeah.
Proximity.
It was also important in this context was that this was early. You can see it was in March 2021. So it's been a while since then. And so it was early. And if you might remember, there was a lot of fear, and it was being perpetrated in particular communities, right? Even more so based on what media folks were being exposed to. So there was a lot of distrust, and for very good reasons, of the healthcare system and anything related to it. And so that was partly too that why they wanted to model the behavior that they were hoping for folks to take. She talks about how she and her staff, they were all vaccinated first, and they were some of the first to get vaccinated in order to be able to make sure that our frontline essential workers working on farms also would follow suit. Yeah.
The other thing here, so Nicole, you mentioned like illness and fatality shows no discrimination, including religious sector. Karen Escalante says they show both sides, that you can die from COVID or you can be safe and healthy. That's part, I think those are important things to lift up. It's also important that they're answering a question that people had. So on the left, you have, we're all vaccinated. This thing happened and we are healthy and without side effects, which was people were really scared that they were going to get sick or they would die from the vaccine, right? And so part of messaging is also making sure that you answer the elephant in the room, right? We can't just go and say, everyone get vaccinated, everyone get vaccinated. We also have to acknowledge that people are afraid, right? And then start to engage with their fear, right? In order to sort of get to our message and advance, in this case, vaccination. Okay.
We're gonna do it one more time.
One more, yeah. And Mayor, we're gonna drop a link in the chat for you all. I think that seems right. This is from this. So this is a goal. The goal was to expand the perception of who transgender people are to increase familiarity and acceptance of transgender individuals. And the audience for this was Hispanic parents, middle-aged conservative Hispanic voters. This is now a long time ago, but this was when it's interesting. I'm going to say it was a long time ago, and at the same time thinking, and the same thing is happening now. But at the time, around the country, outside of California, there were several laws that were being considered or being passed about like trans people's access to bathrooms, right? And this is what was happening. And California, in an effort to sort of preempt the conversation, created a campaign designed to increase proximity, because we knew that one of the reasons that those bills had any legs at all in other places is because people lacked proximity. So as Mayor said, their amygdala was firing, right? This felt unfamiliar. And so this was a campaign that was designed to create deeper familiarity for people. So
just to not have any video problems, the video's in the chat, and I'm going to mute everyone. And so you'll just watch it on your own screen and then maybe drop an emoji when you're done.
All right, looks like people are, I've got some emojis. Yeah. I feel like we're good. If you're just wrapping up, feel free to sort of continue wrapping up, maybe give it, I feel like we did 3 minutes, so that's about the length of the video. Anybody come off mute and let us know. Thank you. The emojis are coming. Excellent. Let us know what felt strategic about this story. Got powerful video, real. Okay. Let's keep going. You can take yourselves off mute. I think, Mayor, they should be able to do that, right? Raise your
Yeah,
hand.
you can take yourself off.
Yeah.
It modeled the journey of the family, accepting, bow, and yeah, that's what I got from you.
Okay.
Like it was like the authenticity, can't say that right now. Yeah, of their journey.
What I got real in here in the chat, and then you said authenticity. What made it feel authentic? And that's for anybody. You can answer somebody else, but what felt authentic?
I would say the relatable, where you have families talking without having to have academic scholarly people put it in a theory and talk about these are the stages and all that. Now this is family saying this was our stages and the real, and then there's warmth there. And it's also what I saw from it too is they're trying to understand it. And it didn't mean they didn't love any less. They were understanding it and walking through the journey, which made it powerful.
Yeah, like acknowledging that it can be difficult, right? Or confusing, or acknowledging and normalizing having questions and experiencing having your questions answered in a way that doesn't feel like heavy conflict, right? Because it's scary to be wrong, right? So that's something that the video does. I see Kylie talking about being filmed in the home, having dinner, making it feel very intimate, right? It also, I'm seeing a lot here around, like, I feel like there's a political piece of this conversation, and this video was not about politics, it was about family, right? It wasn't about theory, it was about family. See, not ignoring the uncomfortable feelings and the honest look at the evolution of changing their mind. Yeah, that change is hard, but we went back to that image. Just the fact that the entire family was willing to make the video, that was huge. Yeah, that also is important, right? We're seeing the entire family sitting down to do something that ultimately is advocacy, right? In some way, right? But just by sharing their story. Yeah, and the emotions. You did great. Thank you.
Awesome. So like I said a minute ago, we wanted to talk a little bit about some of the ethics of storytelling. And this is especially important when you're working with young people or other communities for whom there can be, we know that our stories are not always told in ways that are supportive, and that sometimes storytelling can do harm, even in our movements. And so we just want to talk about that for a minute. So what is ethical or decolonized storytelling? And this framework comes from a group called Resonance that I do some work with. And it's just remembering that storytelling belongs to all of us. It shouldn't just be that those in power get to tell stories. You may have heard, I think it's, the story will always be told by the lion until the food gets to tell the story. I'm butchering that, right? But that all of us should be able to tell stories. And that what's important, though, is that the responsibility and the care should be on the storyteller. They should always be centered in order so that the storytelling is empowering and brings communities together rather than creating any kind of division or harm. And that because some of us, whether we're women or queer or folks of color or other parts of our identities, there are so many negative stories that are told by us. It's even more important to really have a lot of care with how we tell storytelling. So on the next slide, the most important things to remember are just that it's not just about the story, but it's about the process. If we use that example of that family, if you're going into somebody's home to film them and get their story, how that feels and how the care for the storytellers happens may matter even more as whether the end video was really effective. And so you want to think about when you're talking to folks who may be storytellers, it's their consent that matters. It's not about deciding, oh, I shouldn't have Michaela tell her story, it might be too much. But to say, Michael, here's what you might want to think about. Here's the risks. There's different risks for different of us of telling our stories and letting them make that decision. And then it's really important to remember, especially with young people, but with all of us, people change. And so their stories have to get to change with them. Maybe the story that was authentic for me to tell as a 14-year-old youth leader really was important then, but then maybe I'm 18 and it's a slightly different story. And so we need to help people's stories get to evolve with them. And that we need many, there's no one right story or storyteller. We need lots of storytellers in order to truly break down some of the ways that power has operated in storytelling. On the next slide, so some things to do that can help empower those storytellers is, right, just have those real conversations with them and then prepare them to manage whether or not they want to tell their story. And that they get to decide every time. So maybe today on Tuesday, I'm feeling, yes, I want to tell the whole world about my experience, but in a week or a month or a year, something may have changed and I no longer want to do that. How do you compensate? People's stories are treasure. So how do you compensate them for that treasure? It may be gift cards, it may be paying them for their time, it might be some other incentive, but making sure that we're celebrating and thanking them. Making sure that the first time someone's telling their story in public is not when they're in front of the camera. So how do you train them, have supportive spaces, lots of practice in order to make it easy for folks and help them build that confidence, come over some of those insecurities, right? On the next slide too, sometimes it's about getting a little creative. And so here, this image is from activists in Kenya who were doing work around LGBT acceptance. And it wasn't safe because of a variety of reasons in the culture and political climate there to have actual people telling their stories. So what they did was create a comic book that told the stories of young folks, both straight and queer, on teams together, in schools and in communities together, that helped tell these stories based on the real folks who were advocating, but over time trying to create more familiarity as in part of their campaign to decriminalize homosexuality. So other creative approaches, right? Putting the you, right? Imagine you, how would you feel? Maybe your program already is using art and culture. Those can be beautiful ways to get stories. You don't have to use folks' real names. So there's just lots of ways to think about how do you both tell authentic stories, but also manage some of the ethics. And then lastly, sometimes thinking about storytelling is like, oh, are we trying to censor someone's story? And more, it's about curating the story. We've already talked about whether it's about your organization, about your issue. Audiences probably don't need the whole encyclopedia, 33 chapter story. They need just enough. And so often thinking about how do you curate your story the way that we do every day. So on Monday, when two people ask me, how was your weekend? The stories I might tell to my mother might be different than the stories I tell to my bestie. That doesn't mean I'm censoring. It means I'm curating my story, right? And so just that same concept can help us think about how do we highlight and shift the focus so that our audience, so that our story is real and true, but also meeting audience needs.
So thank you for your patience. We are now at a worksheet. Like, we want you all to do a worksheet and to engage with an activity together. And we're going to ask you to think about sort of the stories that you need to tell for your organization and think about your strategy for storytelling. So first, I'm going to say, before I give you the instructions for what you're going to do in your pairs or triads, I'm first going to say that this worksheet, which Mare has dropped in the chat, has two parts, right? So the first part is around developing a story and asking some sort of key questions that would help you to identify your audience, your goal, how you want to activate, persuade, or neutralize, and then it gives you this table that you can see with a series of prompts that you might consider as you kind of build step by step your story. And then the part two at the bottom of the worksheet is about developing a story strategy, right? So that's thinking about what Mare just said, the importance of having multiple and a diversity of storytellers and stories that you tell. So thinking about how do you go about developing and curating stories, the way in which your organization lifts up and mirrors the values, like the core values mission statement in the stories that you're telling, and then making sure to acknowledge and think about what stories you are telling and those that you aren't telling, and being sort of specific and purposeful about those things. And then finally thinking about the channels you might share. So that is a lot. We are only asking you to do a part of that, right? A part of that today, but we're hoping that this worksheet can be a template for you for your work going forward. So for the exercise that we're going to do right now, we're going to ask you to get into, and I think the directions are on the next slide, right? Let's see.
Next slide, yep.
Yes. So we're going to ask you to work in a small group. We're going to put you in groups of 2 or 3. We're going to ask you to think about one of your goals and one of your audiences, and then brainstorm a story that might be strategic to engage that audience. And that'll be something that you do solo, like quietly in your group. And then each of you will have 3 minutes to share back with your little group your strategic story and get some feedback from folks. So similar to the examples we did before, you'll share by saying, this is my goal, this is the audience, and this is the story that I want to tell. And then we'll kind of talk about whether you've met your audience's goals. And then we'll bring you back together. Let's see, given the time, Mare, what are our thoughts?
We have about 12 minutes in your small group, so we'll bring you back right before 20 after the hour. I'm going to open them now, and then we'll, if you end up in a room by yourself, we'll try to find you so that we can make sure that we get you at least one partner. So opening them now.
Daniel, if you have a question, can you put it in the chat? Okay, maybe no question. Maybe just the hand was still raised.
And a few of you, I'm still getting you assigned, so give me 1 second.
Can I? Oh, okay.
Yeah, do you need to? Okay.
Hi, can I be added to a different group? I was in group 20, but there was no one in there.
Oh yeah, let me get you. Great, so welcome back, those who are starting to return. Everyone else will come pushed back in about 10 seconds. And we just have a little bit of time left, so would love for folks to think about whether any questions, ahas, or reflections are coming up. Welcome back, all.
Hello,
I hope you
hello.
had a good moment to either talk dirty about storytelling or maybe even tell and hear some stories.
Yeah.
We want to just open it up a little bit to hear, how did it go? Were there any questions that came up for
I
folks?
think we've got an echo. So
I'm
can
gonna
you-
do a little muting. So yeah, how did it go? Any questions, any reflections, any ahas, any shout outs to someone who told you a fabulous story? Yeah, we have time for maybe just a couple, either comments or questions. What's up for folks? You can drop it in the chat, raise a hand, or even just come off mute.
I could go. So, Kimani speaking from Young Women's Student Center. Me and my partner, I forget her name, but it was like Linda. It was from Legacy for LA, but we had two different audiences. Like I was talking to budget committee, a board of supervisors to like advocate for more youth employment programs and career programs. And she was recruiting communities, young people and families. But I saw how like both of our strategies could work for both approaches or goals. Like she was explaining the programs and the impact of the programs. And I was talking about like, oh, we need these programs, but I didn't necessarily talk about like what these career programs and mentor programs, like how it would impact the young folks in the community. So I took that in from her approach, like not just saying like, oh, we need these programs. It's like, we have these programs that will do this to the young folks, and these programs would do this to the parents. So like I took that in to like be sure to talk about the impact.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Tumani. And if folks might remember hearing us say this before, we always talk about it's easy for us when we're doing the work to go straight to the hows and the whats, because we live and breathe the why every day. And so that reminder of saying the why, the impact, the purpose, the outcome, how it's affected young people is so important. So thank you for that reflection. William, love to hear your reflection or question.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Yeah, so basically, just discuss with my partner. First, what our goal would be. Our goal is to support 46 African American high school seniors in the Los Angeles area who will be attending four-year college and university in the fall with an academic scholarship. And our target audience is high schools, the Los Angeles area. Youth organizations, community organizations, any organizations that that deal with children and the youth, and the mindset of our target audience is those that advocate for students of color that want to see an improvement made and want to invest in students of color in the Los Angeles area. And so our communication strategy would be to activate and to do that, like tell our story by showing our past scholars in the past, the schools that they come from, highlighting the schools, the high schools in the area that they come from, the colleges that they attend, the high school, the college completion rate of the students in our program, because we have students in our program that have graduated, and we also assign them a mentor as well. So through the money and the mentorship helps them to graduate from college and help the graduation rate of African American males. Would share testimonials from parents, in our program to kind of help activate the community to want to support, give, and highlight, our signature event. And we, just the shameless plug, but we have our signature event coming up June 3rd, where we highlight all of our high school graduates and, you know, invite, you know, our sponsors and those who want to support to that event to help activate, to give more to our programs. So that, you know, that's what we discussed.
Okay.
I appreciate that you use that language of activation, because I was just typing into the chat and then I said, oh, you got there, right? So yeah, thinking about, is it activating it? Is it persuasion? You know, is it neutralizing? It feels like it's activation. One thing I would consider is to do what? To like narrow, because I feel like what you described was a strategy for storytelling, actually, like all the different things you could do. So I think figuring out if it's that testimonial, for example, of a student or an alum, right? What are the components of that testimonial that you feel would be most important to activate your audience, and then just like boil it down? Because I feel like, oh, you went into a strategy for the whole thing, like all of the storytelling you would do, but now to just get more specific.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we're nearing the end of our time. So just wanted to share a few things by wrap up. All of the slides, the worksheet, all of that will go out to you all in an email that'll come from the foundation either later today or first thing tomorrow. So you'll have that, and folks who were chatting about particular slides, it'll all be part of that package. Michaela, let me pass it to you.
Yeah, it would just be really helpful. One of the things that we're thinking a little bit about is where to go next, potentially. And so just to better understand from all of you, if you would be interested in receiving, I guess, or engaging with us more, but just generally experiencing or engaging with communications in greater depth. Just as a quick, it's 2 questions, just to better understand, would you want more support on communications? And if so, what type of support might be best for you? If you could just take a quick moment to take a screenshot of this and fill this out, or Mara can drop a link in the chat, or let me grab the link. There we go. You can grab a link in the chat. So if you could do that, that would be amazing for us. And then the other thing that I'll say is, and I'm trying to drop the link. There we go. There's a link in the chat. And then the other thing that we'll say is that we have a reading list for all of you. We always have a reading list. And this is just some of the ideas that we've shared in addition to, oh no, share reading list is what I just gave you. So sorry. Some of the ideas that we've shared that, Mara, let's see. There we go. Some of the ideas that we've shared around ethical storytelling, around like how to structure a story, you'll find some links there that might be helpful for you, in addition to the deck that we'll send out later today or tomorrow. And then the final thing that we'll say is that we have workshop. It's our last workshops. So we'll talk more about developing a storytelling strategy this week. We encourage you to workshop your story ideas. If you're coming to anything this week, just think more about that story and come with your questions. And otherwise, if we're not going to see you again this time around, thank you so much for coming to the webinars and trainings that preceded this, and stay in touch. Here are our email addresses, and we'll make sure to send those out to you again as well.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And in the chat, there's the sign up. We do have a few more spots open for this week's workshop. So if you're able to join us either tomorrow or Thursday, that link is in the chat for you as well.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of your day. And thank you all for the work that you do every day.